You all know the topic today, strategic conflict in the 21st century. And what I want to do is lay out a few arguments about that with the camera rolling. As you may know, these CGSR events go onto YouTube afterwards, so if you're looking for entertainment for your family or your weekends, send them to CGSR YouTube files. But, and then when we move out of that, I'll make a few additional comments about what I think all of this that I'm going to talk through now implies for the laboratory and for the role of the center as we move forward in dealing with this new problem. Let me begin by saying that at the national leadership level, you've heard over the last few years some comments about an emerging problem or a newly perceived problem or a problem that's come newly to the fore. Some of you have heard the third offset strategy discussion in one way or another coming out of the administration and others in the national security community in Washington. Deputy Secretary of Defense Work gave a speech in January on the so-called third offset strategy, arguing that, quote, since 9/11, while we've been at war for 13 years, we and our allies, others have studied our strengths, they've studied our weaknesses, and they've put together concepts and capabilities aimed at negating our strengths, aimed at exploiting our weaknesses, and in order to cripple our conventional power projection. And he went on to talk about nuclear among many other aspects of their response to this problem. In 2014, the Quadrennial Defense Review had the enticing sentence, "The United States will not allow regional aggressors to escalate their way out of failed conventional aggression." And thirdly, when the administration updated the President's guidance to the Department of Defense for the employment of nuclear force, it provided an unclassified report to Congress setting out some of the ideas otherwise contained in the top secret guidance. And that report said, among other things, that the threat of global nuclear war has become much more remote. But the risks of attacks on us and our allies have increased. And we must be prepared for the possibility that deterrence will fail and to be able to protect our interests and those of our allies and to restore deterrence. And so my purposes today are to better understand the concepts that our adversaries have been developing while we've been focused on innovating for the war on terrorism and the counter-insurgency campaigns. Secondly, to understand their thinking about how to escalate their way out of failed conventional aggression. And thirdly, to understand how to strengthen our own deterrence and defense posture and response. I should offer a disclaimer. This isn't work coming out of CGSR. It's not work coming out of my role in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for 4 years, although it builds on some aspects of that work. But this really draws on a book manuscript that I had the pleasure and honor of spending a year at Stanford University and writing a book entitled "The Case for U.S. Nuclear Weapons in the 21st Century." You can imagine that this made me popular with some members of the academic world. And it's coming out December 1st, so any of you looking for stocking stuffers, I'm counting on you to do that. Bob Work's proposition that our enemies have gone to school on us is a broad proposition, and I'm looking at a much narrower set of actors when it comes to the problem of strategic conflict. Three actors whose actions in conflict might well cross red lines in our nuclear declaratory policy. And to be clear, we, the United States, reserve the right to employ nuclear weapons, of course, in response to nuclear attack on us or an ally, but in response to some other developments that threaten the vital interests of our allies. And these three countries are, of course, China, Russia, and North Korea. And I list them in that order for a reason, which is, I think Bob Works got the time frame a little wrong, which is to say it's not since 9/11 that these countries have gone to school on us. This goes back to the aftermath of the Cold War and a sort of wake-up call that came with one clever formulation at a Defense Nuclear Agency conference in 1992 in Richmond, Virginia. The conference was focused on the question of the lessons of the Persian Gulf War for the nuclear order. And there was a participating general from India who said, well, this is very straightforward. The simple lesson of the Persian Gulf War is don't mess with America without nuclear weapons. Which begs a big question. Okay, get a nuke, then what? What's the messing that's going to go on? How have they thought about this problem? And China became the first country that had to be seized with this question with the wake-up call that came to it in 1995. You'll remember the Taiwan Strait crisis of the time. Some of you will. Some of you weren't born yet. There you go. And mostly we Americans recall, if we recall the conflict, that there were some missiles involved and the United States dispatched a carrier battle group. But the trigger for the Chinese that there was something new to pay attention to here was the dispatch of a second carrier battle group, which signaled not just an intent to show the American flag, but an intent to get ready for war. And the Chinese, for the first time after the Cold War, thought, we might actually have to face the prospect of war with the United States over Taiwan's status. And China then, at a time when it was just beginning to get its economy together and just beginning to engage more regionally on security issues, first of all, put its intellectual house in order. It did a lot of work inside the People's Liberation Army to develop doctrine, first of all, to develop strategic concepts. How should the People's Liberation Army, how should China think about the problem of a war in which the United States is projecting all of its conventional and nuclear umbrella to safeguard Taiwan? And they didn't have many means, military or other, to make good on these new operational concepts and doctrine and the like, but they put that house in order. And it's of course in their interest that we understand that they've done so, so they published a lot of this. And the People's Liberation Army has a campaign strategy document that's available. The separate services were then mandated to produce service campaign strategies, including the 2nd Artillery, China's nuclear force. And this is available for us to consume because it's in their interest of signaling both their deterrence capabilities and their deterrence commitment and resolve. And the set of ideas there are fairly straightforward. They are focused on creating a conventional fait accompli that would be reversible for the United States and its partners only at high cost. After all, they have to project power across a strait that's approximately 100 miles, and we have to project power from naval bases in Hawaii and the western United States and elsewhere. There's a time-distance mismatch here. Creating a fait accompli at the conventional level is their key first operational concept. But they also recognize that we might not accept that fait accompli and that there would be some risk of our engagement and our use of assets of allies to respond. So the next operational concept relates to putting American allies at risk and American conventional power projection forces at sea at risk. And you know how much progress they've made in creating the capabilities to do these things. And if we still are inclined to prosecute the fight to defend Taiwan, despite punishment delivered to our allies or our power projection forces, and if we bring the fight to the Chinese mainland, then China has, of course, the capacity to strike the American homeland with long-range nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles. They, of course, maintain a policy of no first use and have built a no first use nuclear force so far. Who knows what force is coming. They took the 1997 Quadrennial Defense Review as a kind of template. That QDR said America is going to be committed to all domain dominance, full spectrum capabilities. We're going to be prepared to operate in every domain and to prevail. And their strategy is great. We'll make you vulnerable in every domain where you choose to operate. We don't need to dominate in any of them. So long as you're vulnerable, you Americans will be risk averse and you won't muck about in our vital interests. So at an unclassified level, that's a tidy summary of how China thinks about the problem of deterring and defeating a conventionally superior nuclear-armed major power. A phrase they coined in the early 90s, and at the time they meant also Russia. Now they only mean one country. And China expects this mix of doctrine, transparency, and capabilities to so impress us that not only would they be capable of securing their interests in war if it came, but that we would never go that far, that we would be deterred and dissuaded. We would take every step possible to avoid armed confrontation with China. And over time, we would come to accept that we are not going to challenge China's core interests, as they use the term core, not vital, core interests in the region that include all of their disputed sovereignty complaints. So it's a way of thinking about conflict with America that focuses both on the potential for conflict and the fact that we're competing with each other in the East Asian security environment. Russia was the second to get seized with this problem. More precisely, the Russian military was the second to get seized, not so much the political leadership. Kosovo War, galvanizing. It brought home to the Russian military a picture of NATO doing to Russia exactly what the Soviets had thought about with their armed reconnaissance strike complex concept. Here we had dominance of the skies, et cetera. I mean, you know, I needn't elaborate why Kosovo was a wake-up call for them. Right on their periphery, right in an area they would call a core interest, to invoke the Chinese term. And I would say they put different names to their operational concepts, but they're very similar to the Chinese, which is to say, and I should note, that they use almost the identical formulation to the problem being how to deter and defeat a conventionally superior nuclear-armed major power and its allies. That's the sort of subtle difference between the Chinese and Russian formulations. Of course, we've come to understand that they think about a conventional fait accompli as being something you conduct with hybrid warfare strategies. You create a situation, if there's a color revolution happening somewhere, that NATO might intervene to protect a threatened regime. The Russian military is called upon to exercise force with such swiftness, they actually have the term non-contact war, with such swiftness that they achieve the effective suppression of the color revolution before the NATO North Atlantic Council has even met. Then, of course, they have to contend with the possibility that we choose not to be deterred and that we choose to reject their fait accompli and to use force. And they have, as you know, in a decade ago now plus, plugged the gap in their vulnerability with nuclear de-escalation strikes. Here, the strategy is that they would use these strikes in a situation that's rapidly turning against them to wake us up to the fact that their interests in this event are vital, whereas ours might be darned important, but not perhaps vital in our eyes. But they recognized quite quickly, and you can follow these debates in their journal Military Thought, although by and large for the last 15 years nobody has followed Russian debates in their military journals. But the debates are there to be seen, and they debated whether this was actually going to work to de-escalate. And of course, you might poke America in the eye with a nuclear stick and discover that America is like a hornet's nest and comes back at you. So they introduced something that at the unclassified level we can refer to as pre-nuclear deterrence. And these are defined as long-range, conventional, largely cruise missile strikes against Western targets, generally initially aimed at being low lethality and imposing economic and financial costs on the West. And if that doesn't wake us up, then maybe more lethal. But this was a kind of stepping stone for them in managing the risks of escalation. They, of course, like the Chinese, have introduced space and cyber capabilities as a part of managing the escalation ladder, as a way to make us appreciate our vulnerabilities in these domains and induce, they hope, our restraint accordingly. And of course, if their fait accompli, we reject, and their interim means of dissuading us from acting don't sufficiently deter us, and we still come, then they have the means to introduce nuclear weapons into the theater. Significantly so, at the unclassified level, we can say that they've integrated non-strategic nuclear weapons across their conventional force. Whether they actually have a nuclear warfighting doctrine of the kind they had in the Cold War, hard to know. And of course, if this doesn't dissuade us and we still prosecute our interests, then of course Russia has the means to strike the American homeland with nuclear weapons. And I think, like the Chinese, the Russians would argue that this is a posture and a strategy that ought to work pretty well for them, not just in war, but in peace. That over time, I mean, Putin's been very clear. If you followed his March 18th speech a year ago, in which he made his case for action in Ukraine, he said that for too long after the Cold War, the West has compressed Russia through a containment strategy like a spring, and it's time to snap back hard. And the first step is Ukraine. No elaboration in the speech of what the next steps might be. But snapping back hard against an unjust and therefore unviable European security order is his argument. And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Russian leaders believe that through a very credible military posture to snap back hard, we will show deference to Russia's interests. They won't have to go to war to remake the European order. We will increasingly ingratiate ourselves to avoid that outcome. Third and last on my unhappy storyline here, North Korea. Where my impression is that North Korea pursued capabilities before it pursued operational concepts and doctrine and the like. And that it was essentially not until the US war to capture and remove Saddam Hussein that leaders in Pyongyang decided this might happen to us and we'd really better be ready. And if we're going to have nukes to mess with America, we'd better have some operational concepts for how that might be so. And so the program, the weapons program and the missile program that had been sort of frozen became unfrozen, and the thinking about strategy became unfrozen. And of course, there's not a lot to see in this domain. They don't have large institutions and think tanks and all of that in Pyongyang to produce things for us to read. But they've made a variety of public statements when they declared themselves a nuclear weapon state, and in a national law that was passed 2 years ago, spelling out their nuclear strategy. And that law says, for example, the Army should raise the pivotal role of nuclear weapons in all aspects of war deterrence and war strategy. Nuclear weapons should always round off the combat posture. They clearly think about a fait accompli. It's not the fait accompli of the 1950s. It's not to retake the entire peninsula. It's to take Seoul hostage, which is already hostage under the threat of the artillery that's within range, huge numbers of our artillery. But basically to take a hostage and sue for peace. And if we don't accept the fait accompli, then they, like the Chinese and the Russians, think about separating us from our allies. Keeping the conventional defense of South Korea depends on forces that are stationed at 8 bases in Japan flying the United Nations flag. Those forces don't leave Japan without the permission of the Japanese Prime Minister. That was a non-issue in the 1950s when North Korea couldn't reach Japan. But if North Korea can today threaten to drop a nuclear weapon into Tokyo, I'd have pause for thought. So a North Korean strategy to separate the Allies from the United States in the defense of South Korea, and of course now the ability to introduce nuclear weapons into that equation and to conduct nuclear strikes on the American homeland. If I were using PowerPoint slides, the only reason to use them today would have been a great picture of Kim Jong-un sitting in front of his nuclear targeting map, which shows long-range nuclear-armed ballistic missiles coming in and striking cities like Austin, Texas. That's the one that's most visibly right there. And it's clearly propaganda, but it's a real capability that's coming together with a real strategic intent. And like China and Russia, I think the North Koreans believe that this is a strategy that ought to work for them in peace. That we, the United States, will end our, what's their term of art, our hostile ways and come to accept the necessity of accommodating the regime in Pyongyang permanently, accepting it as a member of the international community, dropping our sanctions, and ultimately acquiescing to the reintegration of the two Koreas into a system dominated by the North. That's their vision. So, these three countries face as I've set out these arguments to people, a common reaction is, come on, they can't really think that we would think that their nuclear threats are credible. We've got 5,000, they've got 5, or roughly something like that. How could they think their threats are credible? And how could they just so readily dismiss our threats? Two reasons. One, stake, and I've already hinted at this. But for these regimes, any war with the United States involves vital interests for the regime. It may be the political survival of the regime itself. It may be the survival of the independence of the state, North Korea. But their perception is we're bringing our conventional power to interfere in their vital interests. It's automatically a conflict of vital interest for them. And for us, the interest in their eyes may be darned important, reputational, the defense of an ally, but not vital. And so if we're in the game of testing resolve with nuclear weapons, their assessment is our resolve will be found wanting by us. We will discover we don't have that resolve. And secondly, so how do they dismiss the credibility of our threats to strike them? Has to do with geography. These are wars we're bringing to them on their periphery. We start attacking, if there's a conflict over Taiwan, and we start attacking the mainland China, we've just opened up the American homeland to retaliatory strikes. Is that a step we really want to take? We talk a good line, but is that the line we want to take? So I'm trying to characterize their thinking and why they believe their threats are credible and why they think ours are less so. In discussing this topic, I find it useful to go back to a Cold War term that Cold Warriors generally think I'm ill-advised to return to because it invokes so much, but which the younger generation I find latches onto automatically, and this is the theory of victory. There was a big debate in the 1970s and early 1980s. Could the Soviet Union really plausibly have a theory of victory in an all-out nuclear war? And moreover, could they believe that they could fight a war in Europe that would stay at the convention level, that they could win at the conventional level, would never go nuclear? And if they did have a theory of victory, should we have one? And what could it be? And we gave it the name Prevail. And Leon Sloss, who was the godfather of that strategy, who wrote a letter to a newspaper a decade later explaining what Prevail meant. And he said, well, it was better to plan to prevail than to plan to fail. But did we actually know we could win? We didn't. Theory of victory. These three countries have theories of victory. It's a nuclear theory of victory. It's not a theory of nuclear victory. I don't think, with the possible exception of Russia, that these three countries think about fighting and winning nuclear wars and that that's their preference, and that they're prepared to engage in prolonged nuclear war fighting to try to secure their interests. These are theories of victory, theories of nuclear theories of victory, built on blackmail, brinksmanship, and coercion. I cited General Sundarji on Don't Mess with America Out Nukes. A more elegant formulation of that is Paul Nitza, writing in 1956, saying that we should think of nuclear weapons as being like queens on a chessboard. They always cast a very long shadow. They cast a shadow over almost every move on a chessboard. If they actually come into play, it's usually in the end game in a manner that's decisive to one side or the other. And I think it's fair to say that these three countries have thought about how to employ their nuclear queens on a chessboard that they, I would argue, certainly hope that they never have to actually employ these weapons, but believe that every day they get benefit out of their presence in the security landscape. So, what's our theory of victory? What's the blue theory of victory to compete with the red theory of victory? Well, there's a lot of wishful thinking. How many of you have heard people say, well, if they do that, we'll turn them into a glass parking lot? You know, simple, useless decision, useless way of looking at this, because of course, that would be a great tragedy of American foreign policy if we were to meet some limited act of nuclear aggression by turning a country into a glass parking lot. The onus, the historical legacy of that would fall on us, not their aggression. So that's no theory of victory at all. I think a second way of thinking about this for many people is, well, we have the ability to dominate at any level of their escalation. All those domains, we can dominate. And for the Chinese, they say, so what? We don't need to dominate you in any of those domains. We just need to make you vulnerable in all those domains. Unless your vital interests are at stake, but that's not what we're talking about. Well, I'm not sure how dominance at each level of escalation turns into, quote, escalation control. Many people go back to the Cold War for theories of nuclear theories of victory. They are often theories of nuclear victory. They often involve the heavy employment of US nuclear weapons. I think there's some good work that's been done on looking at Cold War theories of limited nuclear war. A good edited book came out last year by Jeff Larson and Kerry Karchner, looking at some of this. I actually think there's a lot of thinking about our theory of victory that's implicit in adaptations we've been making to our strategic deterrent posture ever since the war, the Persian Gulf War, 1991. Where we as a nation said, we reject mutual vulnerability as the basis of a strategic relationship with a country like Saddam's Iraq. And we are not going to simply accept the mutual assured destruction MAD, and we're going to put in place capabilities to ensure that we're capable of using force against these actors. And we have forever thus been diversifying the deterrence toolkit. This thinking coalesced in the strategic documents of the Obama administration, the 2009 and 10 QDR and NPR and Ballistic Missile Defense Review and the like, which set out a comprehensive approach to strengthening regional deterrence architectures, with each element of this comprehensive approach contributing something unique to deterrence. And I will cite 6 of them. And this is another time when a slide might have been useful, but I'm just going to read you my list. The first element of this comprehensive approach to strengthening regional deterrence architectures is ensuring that the political foundations among allies is strong. The Obama administration has put a lot of effort into renewing political relations with allies. This helps. So what's the deterrence? You can say, so what? That's nice, but so what? What's the deterrence contribution? Well, if North Korea thinks Japan can easily be separated from America with a hint of a threat, that's one thing. But if it sees us locked politically like this and engaged in cooperatively in strengthening capabilities, it creates a different perception. Second element of the comprehensive approach is maintaining a favorable balance of conventional force. Now, this does not mean maintaining large standing joint forces in all of the regions of the world where we might face challenges. It means having the capabilities in place or rapidly deployable to strip away the confidence that that conventional fait accompli would be successful. That's different from defeating a large conventional force invasion and holding a large piece of territory. We're trying to strip away confidence in the attempted fait accompli. Third dimension, conventional prompt strike, sometimes slightly misrepresented as conventional prompt global strike. Global is not the essential attribute. Prompt is the essential attribute. What's the deterrence value of this? Well, our only means of striking promptly at any distance right now brings a nuclear weapon on the tip. That's not very credible as a threat of preemption. And if your only strike option is nuclear, you're leaving the initiative with the other guy, who has both conventional and, in all 3 cases, conventional and nuclear-armed ballistic missiles. Why leave him the initiative? We can take some of it back. Fourth component, resilience in cyber and space. And there's not lots to say at the unclassified level. But again, this is something about taking the initiative back. This is something about not just sitting there and allowing your adversaries to pound you, especially in a way that might be largely invisible and lead them to believe that you might concede without your publics ever knowing it. Fifth component, missile defense, both within the region and of the homeland. The deterrence value of the homeland piece ought to be pretty clear, which is to say they hold out this last resort strike on CONUS as a way to break our political will. And more than that, to make our allies understand that they'd really better concede to the regional aggressor because America's going to have to sit this one out. And if we're able to block that so-called decoupling effect, this reinforces deterrence. And regional missile defenses. Regional missile defense, we will never win the offense-defense race with these regional actors. But there's still a strategic value to regional ballistic missile defense, which is in, one, it buys you time. You don't necessarily have to go first, and you don't necessarily have to go today. You can go to bed thinking somebody will be protected if they shoot something. It buys you time, but it also takes the cheap shot off the table. Let's think about the North Korean scenario for a moment. North Korea makes a grab for Seoul, fires a nuclear-tipped ballistic missile out over the sea, and says, now sue for peace, because we got more nuclear weapons. Let's keep going if you want to keep going. But if the ballistic missile defense can protect you against 5 or 20 or 50 North Korean theater ballistic missiles, then for them to get one through requires them to launch, well, a great many, doesn't it? And that's a problem for which nuclear deterrence is relevant. to think that a country might shoot 20 or 50 nuclear-armed ballistic missiles at someone else invites questions of nuclear deterrence. Which brings me to the sixth and final component of this comprehensive approach, which is the, quote, tailored nuclear component. And by this, we mean that the United States maintains both its triad in support of its global security commitments, but also a regionally deployable capability that is, some of which is forward deployed in Europe today, but which underwrites our specific commitments to our allies. And the argument here is that, and this is the part of the U.S. nuclear force that most Americans would most readily shed. And in my view, it's the piece that's most relevant to this new problem set. Because if what these three actors might be confident of is their ability to employ nuclear weapons on a limited basis as a signal of their resolve to try and split our allies off from us and to induce our restraint, it's not in our interest to open up a conflict at the homeland level. And these deployable capabilities signal the resolve of the allies. They provide assurance to the allies. This itself is a source of deterrence. So, does all this add up to a theory of victory, a blue theory of victory in this case? My way of thinking about this is that there are three categories of decisions that we want to influence in our deterrence strategy. Roughly speaking, we want to deter, of course, nuclear attacks on our homeland and the homeland of our allies. That's kind of a black and white deterrence problem. And pretty credible that we're going to respond with nuclear weapons for nuclear attacks. At the other extreme are a set of decisions for a regional actor about so-called gray zone conflicts. These are conflicts that fall beneath the actual threshold of war, but North Korea practices these most frequently with its, quote, provocations. We'd like to be able to deter those, but you're not going to deter those with nuclear weapons. And in the middle are a set of decisions about regional escalation, vertical and horizontal, which I think of as in a red zone of decisions because they fall beneath where these actors think we're going to respond with nuclear weapons. And what seems to be happening is this red zone's getting bigger. And so my question is, do all of our 6 tools in our regional deterrence toolkit close out their confidence that they can mess with us in that area by taking actions that they think fall beneath our nuclear response threshold? And I think we should be pretty confident of the pathway we're on. That we can negate coercion of our allies. We can we can strip away some of the confidence in their blackmail and brinksmanship strategies. We can make it, particularly with cyber and space tools, very difficult for them to calculate what the risks are. If you're going to enter a conflict and don't know what the risk is, there's a cost you can't calibrate, that works against taking action. There's some evidence to suggest that the Chinese a year ago were seriously debating teaching Japan a military lesson, essentially taking the Japanese Coast Guard and Navy out of business. And part of the discussion in Beijing, allegedly, is, okay, well, what's the economic consequence of this going to be? The principal job of the Chinese leaders is to build employment for large numbers of emerging people. What's going to be the economic cost? And well, they really couldn't characterize it. And allegedly, this was a significant disincentive. So I just tell that story because if you're making decisions about escalation and de-escalation, you're trying to understand the risks and resolve, your risks and the resolve of the other guy. And I'm saying that if you can't calculate your risks and costs, and I think our cyber and space tools help us do that, make it difficult, they complicate it for the adversary, then you're contributing something useful. I also think there's an argument about asymmetry of stake. It's true that a regional conflict involving a core interest of China's, for example, would not involve a vital interest of the United States until it goes nuclear and until it involves the vital interest of an ally. And particularly, I mean, those are two big thresholds for us. And this would create interest for us that it's not clear that our adversaries have thought about or understood, or that even we think about and understand. And I think we could get some deterrence benefit by being more explicit about the way in which a conflict, a regional conflict that's gone nuclear in some dimension, creates interest for us of a new and different kind. So in setting out the theory of victory argument, I like to say that I think that there are there's theories of victory of two kinds. First, in the spirit of Clausewitz. Clausewitz, if you see war as a continuation of politics by other means, what's victory? Victory is not vanquishing your enemy. Victory is reaching, quote, a culminating point in a conflict when your adversary chooses peace because the costs and risks of continued conflict are too high. And I think there's a good argument that both red and increasingly blue have a Clausewitzian understanding of a nuclear theory of victory. There's a second meaning of theory of victory, and that's in the spirit of Sun Tzu, persuading an adversary to cease and desist without actually going to war. I think both red and blue have that concept as well. We want to believe that our deterrence strategies are going to be effective not just in assuring our allies and deterring aggression, but that over time they're going to create the conditions that allow the Soviet Union to collapse, that allow North Korea to become something different, and that allow China and Russia to modernize and emerge as peaceful members of the international community. So I think we too have theories of victory in both respects. A few more arguments and then let me close, because what I'd like to do, particularly for this community, is talk about the role of nuclear weapons, US nuclear weapons, in this theory of victory. What do they contribute that's particular and unique? And again, I have a list, and sorry to not have a slide that makes it more digestible. But the first is to cast a shadow of unacceptable risk over any regional conflict. These are our nuclear queens on a chessboard where we have more players than any of these enemies, prospective enemies. And we should understand that that's a part of their function in our security strategy. Secondly, they are a signal of the political resolve of the United States and its allies to defend our vital interests. In a tabletop exercise we conducted with a Northeast Asian ally, we discussed the sort of the two-step North Korean fait accompli nuclear demonstration shot. What do you do? And many of the American participants said, well, at that moment we would fly B-52s, nuclear-armed B-52s. This would be a powerful demonstration of our resolve. And our senior participating Northeast Asian participant said, wrong answer. It would have exactly the opposite effect from the one you intend. Because what, at this stage of the conflict, the North Korean leader is testing isn't your American resolve. It's our collective resolve as an alliance. It's our South Korean and Japanese resolve to stay in this conflict with you. And by displaying nuclear resolve with a nuclear tool, with an American nuclear tool, you're doing nothing to signal our resolve, and in fact, you're confirming his perception that we're not in this game with you. This is an uncomfortable argument for many Americans to hear, who would prefer to think that the triad alone is the credible tool for signaling resolve. And my point is, in the kinds of regional conflicts we're thinking about today, these theater capabilities that are shared with allies have a value unlike what we've associated with them in the last couple of decades. Third role of U.S. nuclear weapons is to demonstrate our capacity to respond to actions that cross red lines in our declaratory policy. We've made some clear statements. We better be able to make good on them. And to remain resilient in the face of attack. Fourth, to assure our allies that the United States has the will and the capability to defend their vital interests. Our conventional forces don't do this in a world in which they are threatened by nuclear weapons. Fifth, to ensure a balance of strategic power with Russia and China. And lastly, and one that's often overlooked and that Jim Schlesinger felt very strongly about, and I think rightly so, the sixth and final function is to assure the American public that the costs and risks of international engagement and leadership are bearable. You know, part of the debate that's driven by the emergence of North Korean nuclear capabilities is, why don't we just pull out of Northeast Asia? Why don't we let Japan and South Korea take care of this problem for themselves? Isolation serves us better. In my view, this is the red theory of victory working, but that's another topic. So, I've tried to take you through what I think red is. I've tried to take you through what I think blue is. I think I'm being a little kind to blue. I'm a little bit putting pig on a lipstick on a pig. You know, we've done our homework on blue on North Korea, I believe. And of course, we've been doing a lot of homework on China as a problem of deterrence strategy. And of course, we're just getting started on our homework on Russia, again, as a problem of our, not as a problem of strategic deterrence, but as a problem of regional theater deterrence. So we're better on North Korea than China and Russia. I think we're better on concepts than on capabilities. We, the United States, have talked about this comprehensive strengthening approach in one way or another since the Persian Gulf War. But if you were to do a net assessment and ask, so which capabilities have we actually put in the field? How actually resilient are these regional deterrence architectures? Well, the missile defense piece is pretty thin. You know, we're still talking about CPGS. How are we doing on space and cyber? And so our eggs are all a lot in the nuclear basket still. Makes that regional part of the deterrent all the more important. And without saying much in an unclassified forum about this topic, let me also say that I think we're better on capabilities than on plans. Our traditional way of planning for this theater strategic problem is conventional warfight. That goes badly, over to you, STRATCOM. 2 bar charts, one on top of another. And if we're going to get this problem right, this needs to look like a multi-striped candy cane rather than 2 bar charts, one on top of the other, meaning we need to be able to cast deterrence shadows deep into a regional conventional conflict. And a regional conflict that goes nuclear may only go briefly nuclear, and there will be a long continuing conventional fight afterwards. So we're casting both nuclear deterrence shadows and conventional operations. This needs to be, and we're interweaving cyber and space into this. This is a hard problem. So, in conclusion, the hints you've seen about a new problem reflect sincere, sustained focus inside the Department of Defense and elsewhere on an emerging strategic problem. Second, at least 3 countries are pretty far along in knitting together a theory of victory and the capabilities that in each of these 3 countries are now in the field and are being exercised for us to see. And third, we're playing catch-up. We've done a lot of homework. I think in a real test of capabilities and resolve, we would be the better, but it would be excessively costly, and I think we reduce the risks of that if we take take steps to continue to strengthen the regional deterrence architecture.